This is GARIS Masculist MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is part 2 of a 3-part flyer. This is flyer number 441, entitled Masculist Advice to Governments. Carrying straight on. You feminists have to learn that you no longer have a monopoly over gender politics. From now on, you'll have to share the gender political stage with the masculists. And since we masculists are men, we will quickly dominate that stage the way we men dominate everything. Since you women, with your 10% smaller brains, your 4 IQ point lower average IQ compared to men, your pathetic 1% of science Nobel Prizes, etc., you cannot compete with men at the top end of the performance scale. You feminists behave as though you are the superior sex, but in reality it's the other way round. We masculist scientists are fed up with your PC, is-sign-it fairy bullshit and crush it whenever we come across it. We tell young women that it is you monoconscious feminazi bigots, MFBs, who have taken over the divorce courts and made them so toxic for men that they refuse to give women their sperm because they utterly reject the risk of 1 chance in 4 of being financially massacred, and if they are stupid enough and ignorant enough to marry and have kids. So these young women are increasingly learning to hate you for causing their babylessness as a man. With both sexes hating you, you will soon either convert yourselves into being bi-conscious feminists, that is, you educate yourselves into being equally conscious as to how women oppress men as vice versa, so you unlearn your feminazi bitchiness, seeing that in fact women oppress men far worse than vice versa, due to Fluffy's decades-lasting manslaving parasitism. Masculists have a hatred of manslaving fluffies and fluffy feminist hypocrites who want equal rights with men in the parliaments but reject equal obligations with men to share the burden equally of earning the living in the fluffy feminist controlled divorce courts. Your fluffy feminist hypocrisy makes you hated by the masculists even more than masculists hate the manslaving fluffies. It's bad enough that you are fluffies and hence manslavers, but you're also hypocrites. As the number of masculists rises, there'll be more and more of these bitter confrontations between masculists in the audience and monoconscious feminazi bigots. The audience in the universities will become increasingly exposed to masculist ideas until they become well known, written about in student newspapers and blogs, etc., until most university students become bi-conscious, and anyone who remains monoconscious will be considered retarded, backward, dull, slow, conservative and bigoted. So, I see the role of the early masculists, that is the highly articulate ones, well versed in masculist ideas, playing the role of the initial spark in getting politicians to take up the cause of the masculists via the journalists, who will become aware via the universities that men are on the move, that the 2020s is the decade of men, the decade in which men liberate themselves from manslavery, who push politically for the para, etc. Probably in practice, both broad strategies will play themselves out. There will be masculist champions in the feminist speaker audiences, which will include journalists, who become conscious that men are on the rise and rush to be the first to make big stories about this rise and hence spread masculist ideas to the millions, the masses, which in turn will change the zeitgeist so that the politicians learn of masculist ideas, and particularly the idea that the population crash is due largely, in brackets, but not exclusively, to the rejection of paternity by masculisted/MGTOWed men, due to the toxicity of the divorce courts, taken over by the hated, fluffy feminist hypocrites. Once the politicians are well informed of masculist ideas, along with the general public, they will start to implement the reforms of the gender laws so that the masculists are pushing for. I now come to what the gender politicians need to do to satisfy the masculists, so that millions of men are prepared to be fathers again, so that millions of men are prepared to have relationships with women again, instead of living the MGTOW lifestyle, seeing feministed women as misandrist, male-dumping, feminazi bitches who deserve only to rot on the shelf, and be spat at and ignored to death, literally, not even being pumped and dumped. So great is the hatred of the masculists/MGTOWs towards the MFBs in what they are doing to men, particularly in the divorce courts. So here is a list of things that the gender politicians need to do to make the masculists happy. I'll list them first and comment later. This is in bulleted form. Bullet. Reform the divorce courts. Bullet. Legislate the para, that's paternity rejection right. Bullet. Boyfair the primary and secondary schools. Bullet. Push girls to FIP up. Bullet. Create gender equality committees in the parliaments that consist half female feminists and half male masculists. Bullet. Systematically eliminate sexual discriminations against men across the board. Bullet. Promote masculist consciousness in the population so that monoconscious feminazi bias is killed off. Bullet. Promote the creation of masculist groups in every high school, every campus, so that the whole population becomes bi-conscious, so that monoconscious feminist bias is killed off. Bullet. Give government grants to masculist academics and professors so that they can write and research masculist issues, so that whole libraries of masculist scholarship can be written to rival that of the feminists. Bullet. Promote gender politicians to take an even-handed view when talking to the public about gender oppression, not reinforcing the bigoted feminazi view that gender oppression is a one-way street. Bullet. Parents and teachers need to be pushed to promote fitness in girls, scaring them that if they don't FIP up, then they will be severely punished by young men refusing to have anything to do with them, rejecting them socially and sexually, forcing them to rot on the shelf, manless, sexless, babyless, and spat at as vile, man-slaving parasites. Bullet, etc. Many more. Elaboration. Bullet. Reform the divorce courts. The divorce courts are screaming out for reform. If they are not soon reformed, there will be a sex war, since no culture that financially crucifies and destroys the lives of a quarter of its fathers can remain intact. Men will explode, take up arms, and go on a sex war, assassinating the gender politicians who made these deeply misandrous laws in the first place. Murder thousands of fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges, and may even go out into the streets and shoot millions of MFBs. More concretely, alimony is to be thrown out. Divorcing wives are to be seen as FIPs, so that alimony is not needed. Custody of children is to be made joint by default, so that young men no longer need to argue amongst themselves, quote, fuck marriage, fuck paternity. I'm not going to take a 1 in 4 chance of having some fluffy parasite wife take my kids away from me and force me to pay for her for the rest of my life. Fuck fluffies, and fuck the hated feminazi divorce court lawyers and judges. They are massive criminals who deserve to be shot. Look what they're doing to men, and indirectly wiping out whole populations, making themselves genociders. The treatment of men in the divorce courts is a war issue. It's indirectly wiping out whole populations, which is something the gender politicians need to be told about, so that they can step in and reform the divorce courts, making them fair to men. Bullet. Legislate the para, that's paternity rejection right. The fact that women have the mara, maternity rejection right, commonly known as the abortion right. That is, women have the legislated right to reject an unwanted pregnancy, but men don't have the power, is the most blatant form of sexual discrimination that exists. And it's not against women, but against men. This massive gender inequality makes masculists murderously angry. This is another war issue. Masculists are full of hatred towards the fluffy feminists in the divorce courts who see men simply as cash machines to be abused and robbed, denying men the right to keep their kids. Otherwise, why would young men ever be persuaded to be fathers in the first place if they are forced to face a 1 chance in 4 of losing them, which are odds that most young men today refuse to accept? Gender politicians need to understand that the level of hatred coming from men against the fluffy feminists in the divorce courts, not having the power, etc., is leading inevitably to a sex war unless things change. The US Civil War against Negro slavery took decades to brew. And similarly, the masculist hatred against manslavery is also brewing and will boil over in the next few decades unless the gender laws are men-faired. Bullet. Boy-fair the primary and secondary schools. The large majority of primary school teachers, and increasingly in secondary schools, are women, so that little boys get almost no male role models to identify with. Instead, they're taught by monoconscious young feminists that men are toxic, that men are rapists, and the like, killing their self-esteem. Gender politicians need to give male primary and secondary school teachers higher salaries as a form of positive discrimination, so that more men are attracted to such teaching, thus giving young boys more male role models so that they can feel more positively about being male. What the monoconscious feminists are doing to young boys in the schools is a major gender crime that only increases the level of hatred by the masculists against them. This is the end of part 2.